Hey internets, this video is intended to be the most intellectually honest assessment of Nick Fuentes and the Groypers that can possibly be made. We'll be going over what they get wrong and what they get correct, and also why the current global establishment seems completely incapable of dealing with them, or really just understanding them, or even getting anything right at all in regards to the Groypers in any way. This means that this is yet another video that unfortunately has a pretty good chance of getting hit with the demonetizo shadow ban bot, because the thing about the Groypers is that it's kind of impossible to talk honestly about them without triggering the normies in some fashion. Honesty has a cost, and the cost is shadow ban. So there won't be any kind of sponsor or selling anything for this video. If you really want to help me out though anyway, you can support me on Ko-Fi or Subscribestar or become a member of the channel. Because yeah, this isn't really the kind of video that you can ask a sponsor to help cover the cost of the time needed to make it. Which then kind of leads to the immediate question. If you can't really make money off of this kind of video, and even covering the Groypers is kind of risky to my channel's shadow ban status, why talk about it at all? And the answer to that is because this video really needs to be made. There are a lot of videos out there that are talking about the Groypers and pretending to understand them that are painfully milquetoast and clearly don't know what they're talking about, especially legacy media. In fact, let's start with that, going over a brief explanation of just who the Groypers are, because much of what legacy media has had to say about the Groypers is extremely poor in terms of factual quality, partially because Groyper politics are in extreme opposition to what is considered acceptable in mainstream discourse, but also a large part of it, I suspect, is just due to genuine inability of those inside the normie box to comprehend those who are too far outside that box. This is because the origins of the Groypers actually has absolutely nothing to do with Nick Fuentes. In fact, Nick Fuentes is really largely irrelevant to the movement of the Groypers in general. He just happens to be the current flag bearer. Rather, their true origins are deeply rooted in image board culture. Things like 4chan, 7chan, Infinity Chan, Lane Chan, All Chan, those dozens of other chans we don't talk about Chan. Let's be honest, most of them are kinda dead anyways, etc, etc. Which of course gives us the first hint as to why corporate journalists are just completely incapable of understanding them. Image board culture is notoriously anti-normie, and yet corporate media almost exclusively employs said normies. So it really doesn't come as a shock then as to why so many journalists, when they try to write about the Groypers, seem to those of us who do understand the Groypers that they're in a constant state of severe confusion. It's just too far outside their reality for them to grasp. It's not just because the Groypers have some really radical political views, but rather a good analogy for it is that they just come from a completely different culture of a completely different country altogether. I know this very well as someone who also has similar origins, being a bit of a professional meme-smith, anonymous shite poster back in the early 2000s myself. And so I'm uniquely aware of how darn near impossible it is for some CNN sorority journalist who has spent their entire life in a tutorial difficulty bubble to comprehend even 1% of the multiple layers of irony needed to truly get it and truly grasp image board culture. And to be honest, I don't think they'll ever get it. I don't think they can get it. I don't think it's cognitively possible for their brains to ever comprehend it. The rabbit hole is just too deep for them. But it doesn't matter because the number of red pills they would have to take to even begin entering that rabbit hole are too many for them. It would just completely crush their minds to oblivion. But that's just beating around the bush. So who are the Groypers, really? Well, because the origins are rooted in image board culture, which is rooted in anonymous, Groypers aren't really a standard organization in the way you would think of it. So it's more of an ideology and a political movement. They are mostly a group of far authoritarian, loosely right-wing, mostly men under the age of 40, who have beliefs that include ultra-ethno-nationalism, America first, right-wing cultural beliefs, Christian nationalism, although they're not quite necessarily as serious on that as some people believe, going on expeditions to find Hyperborea, the JQ, yeah, we'll get to that one later, but also, strangely enough, center-left economic beliefs. Yeah, on that last one, we'll also get to that one later. For now, here's just more about who they are and where they come from. Image boards and image board culture comes from something that has existed for a little over 2 decades. They allow anyone to anonymously post just about anything so long as it wasn't illegal, without the need to register, and so discussions on image boards are notorious for having extremely low moderation and thus very high free speech. This creates a form of discussion that much of the boomer generation and Generation X are completely unused to, because in the normie sphere, a lot of political and ideological and philosophical discussions are largely focused on who is saying what, as opposed to what is being said. When a boomer is watching their primetime TV news on their normie box, a lot of times they will view opinions being said as true based on the anchor that is saying them. them. And so a lot of the older generations, they're just kind of used to accepting that as valid truth. Famous guy in the normie box said it, therefore it is true. A rather unfortunate but effectively accurate explanation of boomer lib epistemology. That's pretty much how they get their knowledge. However, image board culture completely flips it on its head. Everyone's anonymous. Who you are doesn't matter. There's no such thing as social reputation here. The discussion is now focused entirely on what is being said. And so normal social shaming tactics in these kinds of discussions don't work anymore. For example, you can't just call somebody a racist in these boards and then just automatically be considered correct. The type of moralizing and shaming arguments and association fallacies that are popular on legacy media, they're just not effective here. And so the normal boomerality tactics of finger wagging your way to victory in any kind of debate, well, it just doesn't work here. And because of this, the most popular ideologies on these image boards ended up being ideologies, interestingly enough, that were completely different from the establishment. Because without those moralizing propaganda techniques, establishment opinions quickly reveal themselves to be completely indefensible. In fact, the general consensus in places like the old /news or /poll or other places where politics and philosophy were discussed, even /b sometimes, or heck, if you're a true old friend, you may even remember back when we were talking about this stuff on /a, we quickly reached a sort of conscious consensus that much of what had been sold as true by the boomer establishment was in fact nothing but a bunch of nonsensical, hypocritical, self-contradictory, grade A BS. And so instead what you found on these image boards, again, mostly 4chan, but also other image boards, were first ideologies like my own, which is basically right-wing libertarianism in support of Ron Paul, who was in fact the first preferred candidate of 4chan about 15 years ago. And there's a few other ideas, political and philosophical, that gained some traction within image board culture that normally wouldn't in the mainstream media, but let's just skip to the Groypers. Because another very big one that especially /poll, of course, is known for is, again, ultra far-right ethno-nationalism, to the point of having several threads per day just outright praising Adolf Hitler, accompanied with the usual things such as Holocaust denial, blaming everything on the Jews, you know, again, stuff that's generally considered just completely inconceivable and totally unacceptable within the channels of mainstream discourse. And me personally, I'm definitely not a member of this ideology. In fact, I consider it just as bad in many ways as communism, and if you've seen my other videos on my channel, you probably have a pretty good idea of what I think of communism. However, I do completely understand why this ideology ended up becoming popular in this kind of environment. The thing is, the Groypers are selling a solution to a real problem. A flawed solution, but at least they acknowledge the problem. And that problem is that the equalityism that has been kind of sold to the boomers through the civil rights era has failed. And because it has failed, it is only able to kind of limp along by hoisting itself up through a bunch of various ideological contradictions. And just about everybody in legacy media is either just ignoring this problem altogether, or they're actually pretending that it's a good thing, despite the fact that it is neither culturally nor economically sustainable. And so thus, before going into what the Groypers get wrong and why they get it wrong, we must first look at what they get correct and how politics in the West ended up in this sorry state. The first thing the Groypers get correct is that young men in the West, especially if you're a young white man, but pretty much all young men, have every right to be absolutely infuriated at the current establishment. And to be honest, if you're a young woman, you should actually be infuriated at it too, because what I'm about to talk about here negatively affects the ladies just as much, just indirectly. So if you're a woman born after 1980, you've probably wondered why it seems like so many men your age have just kind of given up and are completely disconnected and seemingly disengaged from the social system. And the answer is because that system actively hates them. The millennial and Gen Z white male experience is growing up being constantly held collectively guilty and blamed for the alleged sins of the past you had no hand in, while also being told that you still benefit from all of those things despite the fact that the power dynamics behind them were abolished after World War II and actually flipped during the civil rights era. This also comes with the experience of being constantly gaslit about it. A good simple example of this is being told you have privilege through greater access to things like respect and education, when in reality, being a young white male in the age of white guilt means you get discriminated against in college admissions and are constantly being told by the leftist media about what a shitlord you are for being who you are. And it really needs to be stressed how surreal this is and how obviously fraudulent it should appear to any rational person, because when you examine it closely, you realize that this message is completely self-contradictory. The establishment is essentially berating you and hating you for controlling the establishment, but wait, the very fact that they hate you is proof that you don't control the establishment. And indeed, if you look into things like Curtis Yarvin's analysis of academia and media, which he calls In the Cathedral, said establishment reveals that it's created various power structures and bureaucracies that is is overwhelmingly leftist, which has been proven to have an anti-white bias. The TLDR of it is the result is you, as a young white dude, you grow up being the only population group where it is considered politically correct to hate you for who you are, and you're constantly being told that you have the privilege of not being hated for who you are by the very people who are controlling the system and clearly hating you for who you are. It's insane. It's actually completely bonkers. There was a recent article on Compact that kind of highlights the insanity. The Lost Generation from Jacob Savage did a relatively large deep dive into the effects of DEI being institutionalized. The TLDR of it is that employers have been actively discriminating against young white men for quite a long time now, while the cathedral blatantly lied through their teeth claiming that it wasn't happening, even though it very obviously was. And so it comes as no real shocker then that one of the memes you might have found on these image boards back in the day was this one. Congratulations, young white males. With the relatively successful destruction of the patriarchy in your generation and the homogenization of gender roles, you are now officially of no value to society. But wait, it gets better. Given that your fathers and grandfathers still benefit from their patriarchally given gifts, such as the ability to act like actual men in their social construct without repercussion, they won't have any freaking idea why you're such a dumb little screw up because they exist in an alternative reality where they still freaking matter. Bonus gifts. Racism perpetuated by your fathers and grandfathers before you is still within the very real living memory of society, and you get to inherit the title of being utter freaking scum by merit of your gender/race without having actually participated in the evils they committed. Best of all, despite statistically being the most unemployed/hopeless bracket in the entire Western world right now, you're apparently super freaking entitled even though your gender role and racial identity have literally been burned to the ground. But guess what? No one freaking cares, and no one will care. Your parents, society, and women in particular cannot fathom how perpetually effed your role in the world is, and have no effing clue what could possibly be motivating you to stay inside and play freaking video games all day. Another thing that the Groypers are correct about is that the Holy Church of Equality has a very large lie at the heart of it, which shows that one big problem with the global establishment is that they don't actually believe in the equality stuff that they're preaching, because a big part of their equality narrative is backed by one of the most insane fallacies to ever exist, which is a double standards fallacy that can be known as the great global grift of identity politics for we and not for thee. This is best summarized by this infamous post from Christopher Langan, where he makes the argument that identity politics can only be justified if everyone of every ethnicity is entitled to participate, and how the global order's refusal to acknowledge this problem may perhaps be one of the biggest pieces of evidence of their intellectual fraudulence. A big one that stands out is Chris Langan wrote, "Once we cease to treat individuals as individuals per se, thus allowing members of their respective groups to assert their ethnic, cultural, or religious identities against their quote-unquote oppressors, their group properties and statistics are automatically open to scrutiny and comparative analysis." This is something that the Church of Equality has repeatedly refused to do, decreeing by holy order that collectivist scrutiny is only valid under the politically correct context that it is only white people who are to be collectively blamed for things, while against other ethnicities this is deemed unacceptable. And one thing I've personally noticed that's kind of interesting that I'd like to add to Christopher Langan's explanation here is that one of the most telling parts is that the Church of Equality's answer to this, the reasoning they use to justify it, is entirely circular. For example, if you were to point out this inconsistency to a random pew warmer of the cult of woke and ask them how it is justified, why is it only whites are to be held to the standards of collectivist ethno-guilt, they will almost always go on to list all of the things that they view white people as collectively guilty for. Ma colonialism, ma Trail of Tears, ma Jim Crow, ma slavery. They'll go on to list all of these things that the whites have allegedly used to oppress everybody else for thousands of years. Which of course is completely ridiculous because that's circular reasoning. They're just using collectivist ethno-guilt in order to justify using collectivist ethno-guilt. That's just begging the question. There's no actual starting point to their reasoning. And yet, despite this argument being demonstrably nonsensical, it's also scarily common. And so thus academia is forced to contort itself in these kind of weird mental gymnastics and crazy narratives to further justify their narrative, like claiming unironically that, oh, it's only racist when white people do it. Only white people can be racist. It's just so obviously on its face dumb. And Groypers are one of the few groups that are actually willing to talk about this. For instance, in this post from Nick Fuentes, tribalism for Jews, blacks, and Indians, but universal principles for white people. And while Fuentes is wrong about a lot of things, on this one particular subject, he and the Groypers are correct. The cathedral seems to think that they can engage in this finger wagging against the younger white generations whenever it comes to them having a collective identity, but then praises that kind of identity politics for every other group. And very few people are talking about just how completely jacked of a double standard that is. Which brings me to another thing the Groypers get correct, which is the concept of per capita. One of the things that people engaged in that type of circular argument I just mentioned will go ahead with their white people bad rhetoric, is they'll point out that, oh, white men commit more crimes, therefore white people collectively guilty. Except it's not actually true when you consider per capita. This is probably the fastest way to detect if someone has zero mathematical reasoning skills. Ask them to imagine two buckets. One bucket has 20 apples in it and 2 of them are poisonous, and the other bucket has 1,000 grapes in it and 20 of them are poisonous. If you had to choose between eating 1 grape or 1 apple from their respective buckets, which bucket would you choose? If someone says that they'd rather eat an apple from the apple bucket because 2 is a lower number than 20, you are talking to someone who cannot be saved. Just straight up. Do not bother arguing with them, do not bother trying to reason with them. Just wipe your hands of the conversation, walk away, save yourself some frustration. Another thing the Groypers get correct is that the geopolitical establishment is fundamentally corrupt to the core. And this goes far beyond just the identity politics issue I mentioned earlier. They are corrupt to the core, period. For instance, they understand specifically in the United States that both the Republicans and the Democrats are corrupt. They don't exactly get the reason why correct, a bit more on that later, but for the most part, Groypers are correct in recognizing that political parties, pretty much all of them, are terrible. Every single Western democracy can be summarized as just voting for the lesser evil. And this is an issue I've kind of gone over before in an old video I did on boomer conservatism. To summarize it, the Republican Party and also a lot of other so-called conservative parties in other Western democracies like Canada and the UK, etc., well, they don't really conserve anything. Instead, they've largely just been, as many have put it, progressives driving the speed limit. They don't actually do anything to dismantle far-left bureaucratic control that generally tends to happen whenever the more left-leaning parties are in power. Instead, whenever they're in power, they just kind of sit there and twiddle their thumbs and pass another billions of dollars of spending packages for foreign countries. And so when you go to the voting booth in Western democracies these days, you're really just either voting for progressives and whatever they want, or you're voting for what the progressives wanted 20 or 30 years ago, aka which is what the Republican Party will do. The result of this is that if you're a millennial or a Gen Z, the feeling when it comes to the voting booth is that we don't really have a choice. And then on the side of the more left-leaning parties, the Groypers are for the most part correct that they have been using immigration as a way to just increase their voter base. At least within the Democratic Party of the United States, the basic grift strategy that they have undertaken is to just import people from the third world, get them hooked on welfare, offer more welfare, and thus they earn votes. And while Groypers do tend to kind of underestimate just how bad the welfare problem is, they are at least correct in recognizing that voter base replacement is a strategy of the current establishment to maintain their power. Or a TLDR way to put it is that the Groypers are effectively correct in their assessment that Western democracies are currently largely under the control of a bunch of backstabbing corrupt traitors. And thus they are one of the few political factions that is willing to meaningfully criticize that establishment by recognizing the need to attack that establishment even from your own side of the political compass, and actually call out the military-industrial complex along with the system that perpetuates it. So then, if the Groypers are correct about the West's state of fallen, but as you might recall earlier in the video I mentioned they offer a flawed solution to the problem, what exactly are those flaws? Well, now we can finally talk about what it is the Groypers get wrong and why they get them wrong. The first flaw is that Groypers go very, very hard on the JQ, also known as the Jewish question. In a nutshell, the JQ is really just the tendency to blame most of the world's problems on the Jews, alongside often thinking that Jews secretly control much more of the entire world than what they let on. And when it comes to explaining why the JQ is incorrect, I often see a really big problem coming from the establishment, which is that they'll just kind of brush it off and label those who are JQers as, oh, they're anti-Semitic and therefore they're wrong. And the thing is, as I mentioned earlier, that doesn't really work anymore. The whole finger wagging and shaming and saying, oh, you're a racist, you're a no good, very bad, mean person, bigot, it just doesn't work on the Groypers. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to forget all that. Let's just calmly explain from a statistical and evidence-based standpoint why the JQ is a kind of dumb thing to believe, why you shouldn't be blaming the Jews for everything. There's a lot of reasons why the JQ is wrong, and yes, there is the moral aspect of it's just kind of wrong from an ethics standpoint to hold people collectively objectively guilty for alleged crimes of the group, but there's many other issues. The first problem is that most Jews, at least in the United States, are not meaningfully different than non-Jewish white liberals, especially amongst elites. For example, a common silly meme you might see in right-wing spaces that accept the JQ online is they will link to some journalist article that has some incredibly dumb trash lib opinion, often spouting the id pull for we but not for thee contradiction I mentioned earlier, and they'll just point to the coincidence that, oh look, it was written by a Jew. But the problem is you're just as likely to find this in upper middle class white liberal areas. And these articles are actually written by non-Jewish white elites more than they're written by Jews. Sure, there's a disproportionate amount of Jews writing these things, but really it's the ideology, not so much some unique problem with the Jews. In fact, most Jews actually self-identify as white. And so when you see stuff like this, it's actually more accurate to say that white people in the elite class have a kind of self-ethnic hatred problem. They feel guilty for having what they consider to be white privilege, and they believe that by becoming a progressive trash lib, they can absolve themselves of that guilt. And it's not something at all that can be uniquely blamed on Jews. For example, a Pew Research poll back in 2020 showed that the net Jewish is about 50% liberal, 32% moderate, and 16% conservative. And interestingly enough, this also shows something that you normally wouldn't expect if you just listen to JQers, which is that it's the Jews who are less religious who are actually more liberal. And Orthodox Jews are actually 60% conservative, so the majority of Orthodox Jews actually lean kind of right. And in terms of finances, most Jewish households earn less than 150K, with the most standard being somewhere between 50 to 150K. Nearly half of all Jews earn somewhere around that. And the thing is, if we compare this to non-religious whites, we kind of see similar numbers. Another Pew Research study around 2024 showed very similar things. Non-religious whites favor the Democrats in a 28 to 68 split, or low religiousness as they put it. And the thing is, atheists in general tend to have similar economic splits. An additional study from 2023 found that atheist households, well, the vast majority of them are also earning over 50K or more. And if you look at elite universities, you'll find that a lot of non-Jewish white elites have a similar mentality and similar ideology. They tend to be less religious, more liberal leaning, and of course they generally will be earning more money. Are you really finding these coincidences in the Jews here? Or really are these coincidences just patterns that you would expect to find as the logical conclusion of Eurocentric atheism? Because when you control for that, when you look at Orthodox Jews, the Jews who actually practice Judaism, these claims tend to go away. So it would seem that what JQers are looking at is actually just white liberal atheism. And this immediately calls into question one of the basic assumptions of the JQ. If these numbers were totally different, if we saw Jews earning something like 90% of Jews drastically out-earning everybody else for no apparent reason, then maybe the JQ could start shaking a stick. But the problem is most Jews, your average Jewish household, shows similar patterns of every other American household. The majority of Jews are living in a middle-class home, in a middle-class family, and they have a variety of views rather than being a monolith of views, and they haven't actually done anything wrong. And so this isn't just a Nawalt fallacy. The vast majority of Jews are just regular people. And this is why it's kind of dumb to be anti-Semitic. It's not just sort of a, oh, well, it's mean to be anti-Semitic thing. It just doesn't really make much sense. It's not like all of the Jews are wielding some kind of secret power so that they're all living in giant golden palaces while everybody else starves. That's not how the world works. That's not what's going on at all in any way. And if you ever dig deep into this, it's pretty much the same thing all the way down. If you look at white liberal elites who are non-religious, who are not Jewish, and then you compare them to Jews, they show very, very similar numbers. Another issue with the JQ is just general statistical reasoning errors like the fallacy of averages and just the general issues of low sample size. Because Jews, at least in the United States, have just about always made up less than 3% of Americans. And so when you have really low sample sizes, you can end up saying some really weird stuff like, oh, Jews are 600% overrepresented in X. But if there's not that many of them, then it really could just be an issue of one of them blowing the average. So for example, JQers will point to things like Jewish overrepresentation in political donors, overrepresentation in Congress, large presence in the corporate media, and large presence in academia. And yes, it is true, Jews have a disproportionate representation in all of these things. But it doesn't really imply what JQers think it implies. And if you recall what I said earlier about Jewish household income and percentage of Jewish population, the reason why will become kind of obvious to you. If again, when most Jews are just random, ordinary, regular Americans and aren't actually making that much more money than average, and are almost just virtually identical to white liberal elites who are non-religious, well, it's actually just financially not possible for all of the Jews to be involved in all of the donations. It is true that an absolutely insane amount of donations that both the Democrats and the Republicans are receiving is coming from a Jewish source. Again, it's definitely disproportionately Jewish, you can't deny that. However, that's mostly just coming from random Jewish individuals who are very, very rich, giving very large donations. And that just kind of breaks the average. In truth, most Jewish donations are your just random Jewish middle American family donating $15 to their local election or something. So this isn't a NAWALT fallacy I'm making again here. I'm not saying, oh, well, not all Jews. No, legitimately, the vast majority of Jews are not involved in this. Over 90% of Jews have virtually nothing to do with what goes on in Washington, D.C. The overwhelming majority of Jews do not actually have the financial power to do what JQers are accusing them of doing. Same thing with the media. A lot of times JQers become JQers because they see the level of Jewish representation in the media, and initially, if you don't think about it much, it does kind of raise an eyebrow. And so JQers will often post these very large images that contain a bunch of pictures of people who are in various positions in the media and how a lot of them are Jewish. And the problem is you can do this for a lot of other ethnic groups in the United States. For example, the same logic of Jewish representation in the media can also be used against Irish representation in bank ownership. Fun fact, there's actually a very common Irish parody of the JQ, where instead of showing a picture of a bunch of Jewish people in various positions of authority in various organizations, they'll instead show a bunch of Irishmen. And the reason you can make these images is really just simply because there's hundreds of millions of people in the country. Major corporations have thousands of managers, executives, and various directors of whatever. It's not actually as impressive as it seems. And again, the majority of Jews have nothing to do with it. Another weird, also kind of dumb issue with the Jewish question is that a lot of the JQ arguments really do mirror the kind of arguments that you might see from the cult of woke in the left. I don't believe in the term the woke right. I've argued before why it's a bad idea to disconnect the idea of wokeness from any kind of specific ideology, but it is absolutely true that some elements of far-right ethno-nationalism absolutely do make similarly bad arguments, as sort of like lefty prog woke scolds might make. For example, I've seen Groypers on X or various other discussion forums where their counter-argument is simply, you are Jewish, and that's it. They'll just say that somebody is Jewish, accuse them of being a Jew, and then they'll imply that them being a Jew refutes their argument. It's like a very weird, identity-specific version of the ad hominem fallacy. And as dumb as that is, you can find the woke left doing the same thing, but with white people. I have absolutely seen people in far-left progressive circles like Hassan Abi's viewer base, where they'll make the same argument, but they'll just say, oh, you're white. And that's it. That's their argument. You're white, therefore you're wrong. And it's very silly because a lot of times Groypers are able to understand why this is a very, very, very bad argument when it comes from the woke left, but then they'll turn around and they'll attack a random Jewish person with the same bad argument. Or another thing they'll do is they'll point to Jewish overrepresentation in various positions of authority, be it in corporations or in government, and they'll conclude that that means that the Jews are oppressing white people, which is also kind of silly because it's the same messed up logic that black nationalist woketoids use. They've just swapped the races out. They're replacing whites with Jews and blacks with whites. So for instance, you might see a black nationalist make the argument that, oh, there's a lot of white people in Congress, a whole bunch of white men, therefore black people oppressed. And therefore all the whites are involved in a mass global conspiracy to keep the black man down and be oppressing us and stuff. It's exactly the same fantastically ridiculous argument. They're just blaming the Jews instead of blaming the whites. I've even seen some Groypers use the same arguments that woke lefties will use in regards to white privilege, but on Jews. For example, you may have heard when a woke scold is talking about white privilege that, okay, not all white people are in positions of Congress, but all white people benefit from it. You know, that kind of argument. And I've seen Groypers do the same thing. They'll be like, okay, well, not all Jews are in various positions of influence and authority in various organizations in the government and whatnot, but all Jews benefit from it. And the thing is, it's just not really true. For instance, going back on the statistics I shared earlier, there's a good portion of Jews there, around 10%, who's earning less than 30K. If working class Jews are benefiting from it, it's probably safe to say that they're not really benefiting from it that much, at least not in any kind of real meaningful way. And so while I do disagree with the term woke right, it's definitely true that there is a problem of a collectivist right, where they use the same kind of collectivist, ecological, and compositional fallacies, but in favor of white identity while demonizing Jewish identity, instead of other forms of collectivism. Which brings me to kind of a side problem of the Jewish question, which is that perhaps the biggest problem with the JQ is that it's kind of an oversimplification of what's really going on in the world. Because the thing is, a lot of times Groypers or just general JQers, they'll just focus on a problem simply because there's a Jew at the head of the organization or something. Or they'll complain about Jewish donors and complain about APEC, or complaining about the amount of money that the American taxpayer is forced to pay, which is then just immediately given to the Israeli government. And on some pedantic level is correct. Yes, the American taxpayer should not be forced to fit the bill for all of Congress's pet projects. But the thing is, Groypers only focus on the ones done by the Jews. And by doing this, they ironically end up underestimating the amount of corruption that goes on in Washington, because they're weirdly laser focused on the Jews only. For example, the United States in foreign assistance can spend roughly between 1 to 7 billion on Israel in any given year. And yes, that's a lot of money in terms of foreign assistance. But the problem is it's nowhere near the total spending amounts. Like, for example, in 2024, total foreign aid was 82.3 billion. And so Israel's only receiving at most 10% of this. And then, of course, when you have just kind of general questions of corruption going on in the Senate and the House, etc. in Washington, if you go to Open Secrets, they have a bunch of studies on things like the revolving door, dark money, super PACs, and special interest groups. And the thing is, again, yes, there's a little bit of Jewish overrepresentation per population, but in terms of total amount, most of it is actually not Jewish. The vast majority of the problems within the United States government in Washington, D.C. really don't have anything to do with Jews at all. Which now brings me to the second big problem with Groypers finally getting out of the JQ, which is that Groypers are kind of bootlickers. They are correct that both parties are corrupt, but they actually underestimate just how corrupt they are. Most Groypers I've seen, including Nick Fuentes, really only seem to demonstrate a kind of surface level understanding of the corruption that is involved within all the bureaucratic institutions that are driving the West to its doom. When it comes to intellectual spheres on the right, you can absolutely find very educated right-wing libertarians, you can find very educated NRX, you can find very educated monarchists, but it's very rare that a truly educated person is just an outright Groyper. Because while Groypers do understand the problem with the world, they don't fully understand the extent of what's behind it. I think that kind of going back to the JQ a little bit, I suspect that's the reason why a lot of them latch on to the JQ. The JQ is kind of just an oversimplification as an excuse to not fully understand how to fix something. Because it gives people this kind of idea of, oh, you can just easily fix something by doing this one thing, when in reality, dismantling the bureaucratic state is going to be a lot more complicated than that. And so Groypers then propose these alternative solutions that wouldn't actually be solutions. Like, for example, Christian nationalism, which that subject is enough for its entire own video on itself. But to be brief, the problem with Christian nationalism is that maybe it might make a few things about society better if they were to gain power, but not really. It would still be subject to the same issues that drive corruption and inefficiency in the current state. In many ways, it just replaces the cult of woke with something else, rather than actually giving people freedom. Which, on that note of freedom, another big issue with the Groypers is what some people call Groyper socialism. One of the things Nick Fuentes recently said was that the left needs to give up open borders and the right needs to give up the free market. Now, I'm not going to go over the economic fallacies that Groypers use against the free market, because they're exactly the same fallacies as the left uses, actually. The average Groyper has exactly the same economic misunderstandings that your average sort of teenage socialist Vushwasher might have. They just have some right-leaning cultural beliefs instead. They just have a pro-white identity rather than a pro-brown identity or something else. Which is actually kind of weird, because the whole individualism that the free market is kind of based on, in many ways stems from WASP culture. And so my only answer to Groypers who think that we need Groyper socialism is to just read basic economics or something. It's the same problem that a lot of the young left has. They just haven't studied economic theory. And again, kind of going back to the JQ, another bad argument that Groypers will use is an argument very similar to how communists will point to an issue and blame that issue on capitalism, when in fact the issue has nothing to do with capitalism. Groypers will do the same thing, where they'll point to an issue with the economy, blame the Jews, and then claim that the economy needs more regulation. Except when you look into those regulations and actually understand them, you'll realize that those regulations are what's causing the problem. For example, if you watch my Refuting BreadTube episode on Second Thought, Groypers will often make the exact same fallacies that Second Thought was guilty of. They'll just add the JQ to it, and that's pretty much it. There's a lot of other small issues with the Groypers, many of them them just kind of silly and not worth covering. But the last one that's worth looking at is the Groypers' solution to freedom of association, which is basically just mass deportations to the point of race war, a meme I've seen posted on image boards quite often. And the problem with this is that race war is an incredibly stupid idea. I mean, just even if we completely ignore the obvious ethical problems with race war, let's just ignore the fact that millions of innocent people are going to die if that happens, even though that by itself should be a pretty good reason why race war is a really, really bad idea. Another bigger problem with it is that people are likely going to just end up rebelling against it. For instance, just look at the backlash that ICE is already getting for the very small amount of screw-ups that they've had. Admittedly, the mainstream media tends to overemphasize those issues, but the point is it should show you that people are already kind of not interested in this on a mass scale. Doing this on a scale of times 100, which is basically what the Groypers want, would almost certainly just result in mass public backlash. It's also an excuse to not really understand why so many immigrants are coming into Western countries in the first place. And they mostly come for two reasons. One, because we offer them a lot of free stuff, but also because we've passed laws that take away freedom of association. And so they come here and then get preferential treatment through DEI measures, basically getting a full free ride on taxpayer dime. And to any Groypers out there who are watching this video who are not convinced by this, I'll be doing another video later on a newer form of libertarian strategy that will hopefully convince you why right-wing libertarianism, or Hoppians like myself, have a much better, not just a more ethical solution, but solutions that would actually work. Because a lot of the solutions that Groypers offers are solutions that aren't really solutions, they're just backlash to the corruption of the current establishment. And again, yes, young white men growing up in Western countries these days, we have every right to be angry at that establishment. But that doesn't mean you should take these silly edgelord positions of screw optics, I'm going in, because a lot of those positions either A, don't work, or B, they're just kind of flat out dumb. So then what's the conclusion to all this? Well, getting back to the establishment, as I've just kind of gone over what the Groypers are wrong about, it almost seems kind of flabbergasting that the establishment is unable to deal with Groypers. And I think a lot of it can be summarized by that Piers Morgan debate that recently happened between him and Nick Fuentes. Other people have already done relatively decent reviews of this debate, but the TLDR problem is that it shows that the boomers generation doesn't really understand what has happened. And I suspect what has happened is actually just a simple technological one. The creation of the internet has just kind of left the older generations in the dust. And so many of the older generations are still kind of permanently stuck in the origin story of World War II, whereas online discussions in terms of politics and philosophy have hyper-accelerated us far past that story. And that's a big reason why Piers Morgan just couldn't pin Nick Fuentes down. They don't understand that the moralistic arguments of the mid-1900s are dead. They're gone. They're never coming back. They will never, ever work again. That's not to say that moralistic arguments of different types won't work in the future. Of course they will. They always work. Moralistic arguments are absolutely loved by the average person. But the ones that came from the World War II origin story are over, and people need to accept that. And this is especially proven by the fact that all of the attacks on Nick Fuentes have just colossally failed. The strategy of the establishment against Nick Fuentes is mass censorship, mass deplatforming, and mass debanking, and mass demonetization of his content. And the arguments they've been giving against the Groypers are again almost entirely just moralistic shaming, where they'll say, oh, they're anti-Semitic, therefore they're wrong. But those arguments don't work anymore. You have to actually explain your position. And so what happened is the establishment just ended up making total fools of themselves. Because the thing about censorship that I don't think most people really understand, the main problem with it, is that censorship actually just shields an idea from being challenged. Censorship doesn't work largely for similar reasons behind why prohibition doesn't really work. It just moves the production of the prohibited items underground for all the based algorithms to play with. And in the case of censorship though, it's actually even worse because censorship isn't even dealing with a scarce resource like in the case of prohibition. Censorship deals with an idea which can be replicated infinitely. And so you're going to think that you can get rid of an idea by simply banning it underground when that doesn't even work with scarce goods? No, of course not. That's obviously not going to work. In fact, what it did instead is it actually strengthened the Groypers' position. Because again, remember, they blamed the Jews. And one of the arguments on the Jewish question that I didn't mention when talking about the JQ is that a lot of times JQers will say, oh hey, if the JQ wasn't true, then why did they have the need to ban it? Or they'll say things like, truth does not fear investigation. The thing is, that's actually a somewhat convincing argument. It's not correct, it doesn't prove the JQ is true, but it is true that historically censorship is often the sword wielded by those who are wrong. If an idea truly is bad, then you should be able to defeat it in the free market of ideas. It should be not difficult whatsoever to do that. And so by banning that idea, you are ironically actually kind of admitting defeat to the idea. It's kind of sad, really, how this is a lesson that humanity has to constantly relearn. And it's especially a problem with the JQ, because while the Jewish question is ultimately wrong and ultimately unethical, you shouldn't hold the Jews collectively guilty for everything, and they don't secretly own the world. The average Jewish person is, again, just a totally normal person who has done nothing wrong. However, one thing JQers are a bit correct on is, ironically, when it's talking about censorship and certain Jewish and pro-Zionist organizations that perpetuate it. You've got AIPAC, you've got the Zionist Organization of America, you've got the World Jewish Congress, you've got the American Jewish Committee, and of course, let's not forget the ADL, and these are only just a handful. All of these organizations push very heavy pro-Zionist, pro-Israel, and very pro-censorship positions in favor of defending those positions. And it just isn't working. But not only that, but they're also really good examples of id pull for we, but not for thee. Pushing ultra-far-right ethno-nationalism for Israel, while pushing ultra-far-left progressive open society outside of Israel. The truth is that if organizations like this existed for a general European ethnic identity in favor of the white identity diaspora, those organizations would almost certainly be considered white nationalist and would be heavily criticized by the media as hypocritical and subversive. And their answer so far has just been to censor and ban anybody who criticizes them, and it's completely ineffective. Censorship doesn't make you look strong, it makes you look weak, it makes you look incapable of dealing with your opponents. And so for all the shadow banning and demonetizing and debanking and decredentialing, here we are in the year 2026, and yet Nick Fuentes is one of the most popular right-wing influencers on the internet. And a big part of that is because the establishment thought that they could just finger wag them out of existence. You can't finger wag them out of existence anymore. The older generations, the ones who are still largely making up Congress, need to acknowledge the fact that they have kind of screwed things for the younger generations. Because as someone who's spent a lot of time within the same culture that birthed the Groypers, the thing about them is that a lot of them, they just want a homeland. They just want to live in a society that gives them just the basic amount of human respect and dignity. They want to live in a culture of like-minded individuals to their own, rather than living in a culture that actively hates them and actively denies their identity, while hypocritically supporting those very identity politics they are denied for every other group. It comes as no surprise to me that so many Groypers post silly Hyperborean memes sometimes, imagining basically a fantasy homeland for themselves, really just out of a desire to escape from a world that has essentially betrayed them. And so I'll end on that note. I'll probably make more videos on the more specific things in this in the future. Thanks a lot for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you really like my content, you can support me on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, by buying some merch, or becoming a member of the channel. Thanks again. That is all. Till next time.